Welcome to Roleplaying History, podcast where we explore the history of role-playing games. I'm Wayne Davis, and I'll be your guide for today's tour. Episode 127, Advanced Fighting Fantasy, and Sorcery. Before we get into the tour this week, I wanted to take a moment to apologize for last week's episode being late. After having gone out trick-or-treating with my grandson on Halloween, I developed a cold, and it made it pretty hard to read through my copy without coughing after every sentence. So, I waited as long as I could for things to get better, and, well, you know how that turned out. So I apologize for that, and I encourage everyone to follow us on the socials, since when things like that unfortunately happen, I use the socials to keep you up to date. Now, my voice is back to normal, which may or may not be a good thing depending on how you look at it. So let's get into the intro I wrote before last week's issues. This week we're covering 3 games that are all tied together. And I know how I wrote up the title for this week's episode, but we're covering the first game in that list last. And the reason for that will be very clear once we get to it. So how's about I stop prepping you for the tour and actually get the tour bus cranked up? Fighting Fantasy is a series of single-player role-playing game books, and they were developed by Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone. And for the record, the Steve Jackson in this case is our UK-based designer friend and not our US-based designer friend. The seed for Fighting Fantasy was first sown in 1980 when Jackson and Livingstone attended Game Day, which is a convention organized and run by Games Workshop in London. During that convention, they had a meeting with Geraldine Cook, who was the editor of Penguin Books. From that meeting, they decided to create a series of single-player game books. The very first book they wrote was The Magic Quest. Now, The Magic Quest was never actually published in this form. It was written to demonstrate to Penguin Books what exactly the creators had in mind for their style of adventure book. Penguin got the concept and accepted The Magic Quest. However, Jackson and Livingstone decided they wanted, let's say, more for their first book, so they continued to refine their process before the first book in the line was released. That book was 1982's The Warlock of Firetop Mountain. It contained some of what had been The Magic Quest, but it built upon and altered it to fit the full adventure style the creators were looking for. It went through a series of rewrites before Penguin accepted it for publication. Once the initial title was released, Jackson and Livingstone decided to work separately from each other, and not because they were necessarily pissed off at each other. Rather, they realized that if they worked separately, they could produce more titles for the line faster than if they continued to work together on each book. The series of books they produced were published under Puffin's then newly created banner, Adventure Game Books, and Puffin was an imprint of Penguin Games. Get it? Puffin, Penguin. Anyway, let's move on. 1983 saw the publishing of The Citadel of Chaos, written by Jackson, and The Forest of Doom, written by Livingstone. 4 more titles quickly followed: Starship Traveler, which was the first sci-fi setting, City of Thieves, Death Trap Dungeon, and Island of the Lizard King. Livingstone wrote City of Thieves, while Jackson was responsible for the other 3. By 1984, Jackson and Livingstone realized that if they wanted to produce more books for the line more quickly, they were going to need to bring in more authors. Penguin agreed, and the US-based game creator Steve Jackson was the first to join in. Later authors included Andrew Chapman, Carl Sargent, also known as Keith Martin, Mark Gascone, and Peter Darville Evans. Now, even though there were more creators working on books, Jackson and Livingstone, our UK-based team, were involved in almost every step of the publishing process, including approving all of the illustrations and covers, as well as a little bit of editing here and there on the books themselves. During this time, Jackson took the time to write a series that combined sorcery with the combat that he'd already been writing. This 4-part series was called Sorcery, and we'll get into that in a few minutes. In 1986, Andrew Chapman and Martin Allen added their own miniseries to the line with a 2-part adventure called Clash of the Princes. What made this different from those that preceded it was that it was a two-player adventure rather than a solo one. Also, during 1986, several supplemental books were released for Fighting Fantasy. These books were intended to provide more detail on the Fighting Fantasy universe, and among them was a bestiary and sample adventure. Throughout the history of the line, Fighting Fantasy had a number of books that sold exceptionally well. That being said, with the increase in market share by video games by the early 1990s, the sales number began a slow and steady decline. Penguin made the decision to end the line, and while it was originally supposed to end with the 50th release in the series, Return to Firetop Mountain, written by Livingstone and released in 1992, that release sold so well, Penguin decided to add 10 more books to the series. 9 of those were published, with the final release being Curse of the Mummy in 1995. The 10th book was going to be Bloodbones, but Penguin chose to end the line before it was released. However, it would eventually be released by the next publisher to get the rights, and they would release it in 2006. That new publisher, by the way, was Wizard Books, and they acquired the rights to the line in 2002. Wizard's strategy, for the most part, was not to create new books, but rather to reprint the original releases. They did update the covers of the books, noting that the old covers and logos just wouldn't work for the modern marketplace. It should also be noted that when they started publishing the books, only those from Jackson and Livingstone were scheduled for release. They ultimately changed course on that, but they never released all of the previous books in the Penguin line. And while the strategy was to release prior releases for the most part, like I said, there were 3 new books that Wizard chose to put out, with the aforementioned Bloodbones being one of them. Livingstone wrote Eye of the Dragon for a 2005 release, and the book Howl of the Werewolf dropped in 2007. For those keeping score at home, 2007 was the 25th anniversary of Fighting Fantasy, and Wizard chose to celebrate by publishing a special hardcover edition of The Warlock of Firetop Mountain. This release used the original 1982 cover and included extras like the dungeon solution and a look back at the history of the line from Ian Livingstone's perspective. This series of books ended in 2007, and 29 books had been released. Wizard knew they had a good thing on their hands, however, and released a second series of books starting in 2009. Much like the previous series, these were primarily re-releases of old materials, and they again updated the covers. The Warlock of Firetop Mountain was again the first release in this series, and it showed that there was a bit of a format change coming with this line, as the books were physically larger than any previous series had been, using a format more like a traditional role-playing game book. Overall, Wizard released 17 books in this series between 2009 and 2012. There were 3 new books released as well, with Livingstone writing Blood of the Zombies to celebrate the 30th anniversary of Fighting Fantasy. That book released in 2012 and was the final book not only in this series, but also the last Fighting Fantasy book released by Wizard. Scholastic Books is the current license holder for Fighting Fantasy, and they started running the line in 2017 with a brand new book, The Port of Peril, written by Ian Livingstone. That book was specifically written and released to mark the 35th anniversary of Fighting Fantasy. Also in 2017, 5 of the original books were re-released, with all new artwork being used instead of any of the originals. April of 2018 saw 6 more books being released, with one of those being a new title, The Gates of Death, which was written by Charlie Higson. September of 2019 brought 3 more books, with one of those being a new work from Livingstone, Assassins of Alancia. In October of 2020, Scholastic released 2 new titles, one of which was Crystal of Storms, which was the first ever Fighting Fantasy book written by a woman, Rihanna Pritchett. September of 2022 saw 2 more new titles, with Steve Jackson writing Secrets of Salamonis and Ian Livingstone producing Shadow of the Giants. Both were released for the 40th anniversary of the books. Scholastic has promised more books in the Fighting Fantasy line in the future, so if you've played everything that's been listed here, Your patience will be rewarded. But we are nowhere near done with the history of fighting fantasy, because you see, over the years, it's shown up in a bunch of other media forms. Warlock magazine was published from 1983 to 1986 by Puffin Books and then by Games Workshop. It was a magazine that acted both as an advertisement for the game and a supplement for it, since each issue had a short adventure, new rules, new monsters, reviews, and comic strips. In the UK, it saw 13 issues released, but it was published in other countries, and the last issues were published in Japan in 1997. In 1985, Steve Jackson wrote up a picture gamebook. Tasks of Tantalon required the player to solve a series of puzzles, and those were presented as large, full-color pictures with hidden clues that had to be located and assembled. The Warlock of Firetop Mountain and Legend of Zagor were released as board games. Games Workshop released Firetop Mountain in 1986, and Parker Brothers released Zagor in 1993. 7 novels based on fighting fantasy were released between 1989 and 1994. Steve Jackson, Mark Gascone, Ian Livingstone, and Carl Sargent were the authors. In 1992, the game got a 10th anniversary special, Fighting Fantasy 10th Anniversary Yearbook. It was presented as a diary with articles, trivia, and a game book. And of course, it got a D20 adaptation. In 2003, Jamie Willis adapted 8 of the gamebooks in the Fighting Fantasy and Sorcery lines, and they were published by Myriador. For the record, Myriador has been out of business for some time, but you can purchase PDFs online. You know where to go. Fighting Fantasy also got a comic series. Based on Freeway Fighter, the line was published by Titan Comics and released in May of 2017. In September of 2017, the series got the audio drama treatment. Fox Yassin Productions was responsible for the releases, and they launched at Fighting Fantasy Fest 2. The Warlock of Firetop Mountain, The Hero's Quest, was the first release, and 4 more titles came out in 2018. Those 4 were released in their own boxed set, and if you're interested in checking them out, you can get them on fightingfantasyaudiodrama.com or from audiobooks.com. Now, of course, what role-playing game would be complete without a line of video games? Fighting Fantasy has been a part of several. For the old schoolers out there who remember the Commodore 64, 7 titles based on the game came out in 1984, and those titles were also released for Amstrad, BBC, and Sinclair ZX Spectrum, and by gosh, you gotta really be old school to know what those are. For the record, the titles released were The Warlock of Firetop Mountain, The Citadel of Chaos, The Forest of Doom, Temple of Terror, Seas of Blood, Appointment with Fear, and Rebel Planet. Death Trap Dungeon was released for PC and the PlayStation by Eidos Interactive in 1998. Laughing Jackal, a UK developer, released an adaptation of Talisman of Death for the PlayStation Minis platform, which means it was playable on PlayStation Portables and PS3. It was released on August 18th, 2011. The Nintendo Switch got some love. The Warlock of Firetop Mountain Goblin Scourge Edition was created by Tin Man Games and released on September 13th, 2018. Tin Man also dropped the Fighting Fantasy Classics game for Windows and has made Bloodbones available for free, while other titles are available as paid DLC because, of course, we have to have paid DLC for our video games. I'm sorry, that's the wrong show for that particular rant. Nintendo Switch got yet another game with the 2019 release of the Death Trap Dungeon trilogy. Nomad Games handled that production. There have also been a number of versions released as mobile games, but pretty much all of them aren't available anymore, and since this section's been really long, we're not going to get into a whole lot of detail on those. And since this is the history section of the deep dive, we've got one more piece to cover. When Penguin was publishing Fighting Fantasy, the illustrations came from Games Workshop. A number of writers have noted over the years that Puffin wasn't too keen on using the art that Games Workshop sent, but Ian Livingstone has credited that artwork for making the series as successful as it was. But the covers caused a sensation, and I think you know what it was. Fighting Fantasy found itself involved in the same moral panic Dungeons & Dragons was in, as the Evangelical Alliance warned people that the books would lead to players interacting with the devil. And of course, some parents reported that after reading the books, their children developed supernatural powers. One mother even reported her child started to fly. Steve Jackson was asked about the panic at one point, and very cheekily stated that he and Livingstone were thankful for it, since it did what most panics and protests of these types do: increased sales. Okay, so with the very long history section covered, let's get into the mechanics of the game. The very first thing that needs to be understood about Fighting Fantasy is that it isn't your typical choose-your-own-adventure book. I mean, in many ways it is, but it also brings in the use of dice to defeat monsters and solve puzzles, which gives it that tabletop game feel. The formatting of the books are very much like a standard choose-your-own-adventure. That means progress through the story isn't going to be linear. There are a number of sections, and at the start of each section, the player chooses an option. Based on that option, they turn to the page instructed, and so on and so on. The book continues until either the story is completed, the story stops the character, or the character is killed in combat. Typically, the story can be completed with the completion of a quest. Some of those require the player to obtain a certain item. That second one tends to cause a slight adjustment in how the game can be won, because while the game is normally won by reaching the final section of the book, books that require a certain item or items to be found require a very specific path be chosen in order to win. When starting a Fighting Fantasy book, you're required to create a character. This is done by randomly assigning scores to 3 stats, and those are skill, stamina, and luck. Those stats are used with D6s to resolve skill challenges and combat. Some of the titles in the line add stats to the character, some other conflict resolution methods are added, and nearly all of them require that an inventory of items be kept. In that Arcane Magazine 1996 readers' poll of the 50 most popular role-playing games of all time, Fighting Fantasy came in at 47. Paul Pettingale had this to say, quote, "To say that it is basic would be a huge understatement. Fighting Fantasy has just a couple of stats from which a character is created, and combat is a simple case of rolling 6-sided dice, pitching one's creature stats against another. It's fun, quick, and easy, which explains its popularity." End quote. And for the record, in March of 1983, the top 3 entries of the Sunday Times bestseller list were occupied by Fighting Fantasy books. All told, the series sold 20 million copies in the 1980s and 90s. Okay, so we've covered Fighting Fantasy. Now let's move along on the tour and check out Sorcery. Originally titled Steve Jackson's Sorcery, it was published by Penguin Books between 1983 and 1985. The series was written by Steve Jackson with art from John Blanche. Sorcery is technically a part of the Fighting Fantasy canon, but since they don't have numbers within the original 59-book line, they are basically treated as their own series. And Sorcery is a 4-part series, with Ashanti Hills being released in 1983, Kare, City Port of Traps, and The Seven Serpents being released in 84, and The Crown of Kings in 1985. Now, the beauty of the line was that you could either play each of the adventures separately, or you could link them all together as an overall story arc. Sorcery did get a supplement in 1983 titled Sorcery Spellbook. That book was later adapted as the appendix in each of the 4 original books. Also, Sorcery got a boxed set, which contained the Shamananti Hills and the Spellbook, and that came out in 2003. Wizard Books handled that release, as they were the license holders by that point. And speaking of license holders, Scholastic hasn't shown any interest in releasing Sorcery, though that could always change. It's not an overly long history, so let's look at Sorcery's appearances in other media. When Jamie Wallace was adapting Fighting Fantasy games to the D20 system in the early 2000s, he adapted 3 of the 4, with The Crown of Kings being the only one that didn't get the D20 love, or D20 hate, depending on your feelings about the D20 system. Myriador was responsible for releasing the titles, and they did so in 2003 and 2004. Arion Games, who we'll talk a bit more about in our next subject, converted all 4 books into an adventure book for the Advanced Fighting Fantasy system. Graham Botley handled the conversions for the book, titled Crown of Kings, The Sorcery Campaign. Arion released the book in 2012, and Steve Jackson and Graham Botley were credited as writers. Also, all of John Blanche's artwork was reproduced for that release. Last up on this list would be video games. Inkle Studio released them under the title Steve Jackson Sorcery and released the first part for iOS in 2013, while by the end of 2016, all 4 parts were available on iOS, Android, and Steam. So we really didn't get into the plots of the fighting fantasy books, and that's primarily because there were 59 of them. Since there's only 4 sorcery books, let's take a moment and get into a bit of detail. This series is set on the world of Titan, which is the fictional world created for fighting fantasy. The continent used is called the Old World. A powerful artifact called the Crown of Kings has been stolen from the land of Analand by the Archmage of Mampang Forest. Since the crown bestows magical powers of leadership on the owner, the Archmage will be able to take over leadership of the region of Kakabad, which is known for being lawless and brutal, and means he'll use those people to invade surrounding kingdoms, because of course he will. Our player is the lone hero, referred to as the Analander. They've been sent to retrieve the crown and save the day. The adventure breaks down thusly. The Shamutanti Hills sees the players trying to make their way through the hills and plains of Analand. Numerous monsters are fought and many traps are avoided. Kare, city port of traps, sees the player try to pass through Kare and find the 4 lines of a spell needed to open the northern gate and allow them to leave the city. The 7 Serpents sees the player cross the Backlands, which is described as vast and dangerous. Oh, and a wasteland. Don't forget the wasteland part. They have to find and defeat 7 magical serpents that are servants of the Archmage, and they are, of course, trying to get to their master to warn them of the player's approach. The Crown of Kings sees the player attempting to both find and enter Mampang Fortress, which is the Archmage's stronghold. They need to both defeat him and snag the Crown of Kings. All in a day's work, right? The rules and mechanics of sorcery differ from fighting fantasy in a number of ways. The principal difference is that players can choose between playing a warrior or a wizard. You're a wizard, Harry. Sorry. Needless to say, the wizard is weaker in combat, but this is balanced out with access to 48 spells. The caveat there is that each spell is a 3-letter word that the player has to memorize in order to use it. Zap and Hot are 2 of the spells, and I think you can figure out what they are, right? All right, they're Lightning Bolt and Fireball. I couldn't help myself. The reason for memorizing the spells is that when the option to cast spells comes up in the book, the player has a selection of 3-letter words to choose from. Now, of course you could cheat and go back to get the right answer, but if you're playing fair, you have to pick what you hope is the right answer. That being said, Jackson tossed in some false spell words to throw the player off. Some spells require a specific item in order to cast, so if you didn't pick it up, or failed to keep track of whether or not you did pick it up, you can't cast it. All spell choices incur a stamina penalty, and that's regardless of whether they succeed or fail, since of course, failure is always an option. Another new feature for this series is for the player to call on their patron goddess, Libra. They can do this once per adventure, and she can perform a number of different services, like restoring lost stat points or cure a curse. She also has the ability in specific locations to provide an automatic escape from the situation. Writer after writer noted the strength of the continuity of the series, which is another major difference from the fighting fantasy line. It's entirely possible for a player to use the same character through each of the titles, though they will be upgraded through time and play, obviously. There are also clues in some of the titles that apply in the others, so there's another continuity plus. Pete Tamlin handled the review of Sorcery for the January 1984 issue of Imagine magazine and said, quote, "Sorcery is actually a fine example of back-to-basics role-playing. I'd like to see more of it." End quote. Okay, so at the top of the show, I noted we needed to deep dive fighting fantasy and sorcery before we got to the title that was the lead, and I hope you could see why at this point. But since we buried the lead, how about we dig it up and take a look now? Advanced Fighting Fantasy is, as all of today's games were, a British role-playing game. It was created specifically to bring more detail into the character than the original games did. Originally published by Wizard in 1989, Mark Gascione and Pete Tamlin handled the writing, while John Sibbick created the covers. He also gets interior art credit for that 1989 release of Dungeoneer, while Russ Nicholson handled the interiors for Black Sand and Alancia, which came out in 1990 and 1994, respectively. Now, as I just mentioned, AFF was created to bring more detail into the game. It was also designed so that one could write their own adventures for the game, using the new adventures that came out as a guideline. And Dungeoneer, Black Sand, and Alancia are new adventures rather than retreads of other books. Also, more than one player can be involved in the action, so that's an overall change from the original editions. Once Wizard lost the license, AFF sort of languished for a bit. Arion Games picked up the license in 2011, and they released the second edition. They added Sorcery to the game, which brought Magic back in. They also chose to bring a few of the fighting fantasy titles in for AFF, properly adjusted, of course, but they also had to make sure Sorcery had its mechanics adjusted to work with the updated rules. From 2011 through 2022, 23 adventures and supplements have been released for AFF by Arion, and word has it they've got more releases on the horizon. Check out all the news at arion-games.com. That's arion-games.com. AFF has also been translated into French and is released by Scriptarium under the title Défis Fantastiques, les jeux de rôle. They've added new materials of their own to the releases, which includes a 100-page adventure, and they added that to the core book. For those keeping score at home, the adventure is Le Tambour de Gondrim, or the Drum of Gondrin. They've also put new artwork in and have created and released a GM screen that has an original adventure, paper figures, floor plans, and tiles. And since I've already butchered the French language enough on today's show, I'm not going to break down the titles in the series, but if you're interested, you can check out their website, scriptorium.org. That's scriptorium.org. I mentioned the change in mechanics a few moments ago, so let's pop the hood and see what they changed. Characters are now defined by 4 skills instead of 3, with magic being added to the original 3 of skill, stamina, and luck. Stamina can range from 14 to 24, while the others range from 7 to 12. Players can now play dwarves and elves in addition to humans, which was the only race available in the originals. Special skills were added: combat, movement, stealth, knowledge, and magical, and they typically range from 0 to 4. Talents were a new addition, and they include things like natural mage and weapon master. Social class is now a thing, and it ranges from 0, which is basically a criminal or a vagrant type, to 10, which is basically a king. When you go to actually create a character, you start with a concept. This could be anything from being a magical student to a knight. Now, it doesn't have an impact on the attributes, but it does give a guideline for the background as you work your way through. I should note that building the characteristics and special skills, that's not rolled. Instead, creation points are used for the build. Oh, and for those wanting a quick build, there are archetypes available such as adventurer, barbarian, wizard, yada yada yada. Gameplay will lead inevitably to 3 types of tests. The unopposed test, which is pretty much a skill test. 2d6 are rolled, and the total must be less than the sum of a characteristic and a skill. There is the opposed test. Each character rolls 2d6 and adds a skill and a special skill. Highest roll wins. There's also the luck test, which is the same as it was in the original rules, and I was unable to find it from the original rules, so I can't tell you what it is. Combat works the same as it did in the original, though stamina loss is randomly determined. The attacker rolls their d6 and consults the appropriate chart for their weapon, while the defender does the same thing to reduce damage thanks to their armor. Spellcasters must have at least a 1 in the magic characteristic and 1 point in a special skill between Magic Minor, Magic Priestly, Magic Sorcery, and Magic Wizardry, and there are 4 types of magic. Cantrips, which are the easy-to-cast spells, but they only have limited effects. Religion, whichever deity is worshipped grants 3 general powers upon their follower and 1 specific power. Sorcery. In order to cast spells, you must draw from your own stamina. Wizardry. This means you went to magic school and used the arcane power that exists around the world of Titan. Kind of like midichlorians. Wait a minute, did I just say that? Ah, damn. Alright, with that, I think we just need to bring the tour to a close. Next week, we take a look at some of the gaming conventions that take place all around the world, and I'm going to try to be as inclusive as I can here, so they're not going to all be American. In the meanwhile, check out Bad GM's campaign Build Along. This week, our group enters the St. Louis Art Museum to deal with what they hope is the base of Jessica Denman, so they can move on and jump into the conflict between the competing Brotherhood of Steel groups. Bad GM's campaign Build Along is available wherever you get your podcasts or on our website, badgmproductions.net. The music we use for this show comes from pixabay.com. Check them out for all your license-free, royalty-free music needs. Roleplaying History is a production of Bad GM Productions. We're all over social media, so check out the info box for this show or our website, badgmproductions.net, to see where you can follow us. Next week, we go to the convention, in a strictly podcast way, of course. That's next week. Until then, I'm Wayne Davis, and you're Role-Playing History.